The day I discovered my ex-wife had been living under a false identity, I thought I'd seen the depths of human deception. But watching my own children turn against me because of lies fed to them by their stepmother taught me that betrayal has no limits. I should have seen the signs earlier. Sarah seemed too perfect when Mark first introduced her to our kids. She was charming, attentive, and appeared genuinely interested in being a positive influence in their lives. My teenagers, Emma and Jake, were initially hesitant about their father's new relationship, but Sarah won them over with expensive gifts and promises of family vacations I could never afford. The changes started small. Emma, my 16-year-old, began making subtle comments about how I never seemed to have time for family activities. Jake, 14, started comparing everything I did to how Sarah would handle situations. When I tried to address these comments, they'd roll their eyes and tell me I was being dramatic. Within 6 months, my relationship with my children had deteriorated to the point where they barely spoke to me during our court-mandated visits. They'd arrive at my apartment with attitudes that suggested they were being forced to endure torture rather than spend time with their mother. When I asked what was wrong, they'd exchange glances and mutter something about not wanting to hurt my feelings. The breaking point came during what should have been a celebratory dinner for Jake's birthday. He spent the entire evening texting, barely acknowledging the cake I'd made from scratch or the gift I'd saved for months to buy. When I finally asked him to put his phone away, he exploded. "You know what, Mom? Sarah told me you've been talking badly about Dad and her to other people. She said you're trying to turn us against them because you're jealous of their happiness. Maybe if you weren't so bitter about your own life, you'd understand why we prefer being at their house." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at my son, seeing a stranger where my loving boy used to be. Emma nodded in agreement, her face cold and distant. They both looked at me like I was the villain in their story, and I realized that someone had been very carefully constructing that narrative. That night, after my children left early, I sat in my empty apartment and made a decision. I wasn't going to let someone destroy my relationship with my kids without a fight, but I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I started keeping detailed records of every interaction, every change in my children's behavior, every comment they made that seemed scripted or unnatural. I documented the expensive gifts they'd mentioned receiving from Sarah, the trips they'd take that I was never informed about, the family activities that somehow always conflicted with our scheduled time together. The pattern became clear. Sarah was systematically working to replace me in my children's lives. She was positioning herself as the fun, understanding, financially stable mother figure, while painting me as the bitter, jealous ex-wife who couldn't move on. My own children had become weapons in her campaign against me. When I tried to discuss my concerns with Mark, he dismissed them as jealousy and paranoia. He'd found happiness with Sarah, he said, and couldn't understand why I wanted to destroy that. The kids were happier than they'd been in years, and if I really cared about them, I'd stop causing drama. But I knew my children. I'd raise them to be kind, empathetic, and independent thinkers. The cold, judgmental strangers who showed up for our visits weren't the kids I'd known for 16 and 14 years. Someone had poisoned them against me, and I was determined to find out who Sarah really was. I hired a private investigator named Rebecca Walsh, a former police detective who specialized in background checks and family cases. I expected to find maybe some financial problems or a messy divorce in Sarah's past. What Rebecca uncovered was far more disturbing. Sarah Jenkins wasn't Sarah Jenkins at all. Her real name was Sandra Morrison, and she had a criminal record spanning 3 states. She'd been convicted of fraud, identity theft, and something called parental alienation in a previous custody case. She'd systematically destroyed another woman's relationship with her children, using the exact same tactics she was using on mine. The investigation revealed that Sandra had a pattern of targeting divorced men with children and comfortable incomes. She'd worm her way into their lives, isolate them from their ex-wives, and gradually take control of the family dynamics. In 2 previous cases, she'd succeeded in having the biological mother's custody reduced to supervised visits only. But the most shocking discovery was that Sandra was still legally married to her second husband, making her marriage to Mark completely invalid. She'd been living a double life for over 2 years, collecting Social Security benefits under one name while working under another. Rebecca handed me a folder containing criminal records, court documents, and testimony from Sandra's previous victims. 2 other women had lost their children to her manipulations. One had committed suicide after losing custody completely. The pattern was clear, methodical, and devastating. Armed with this evidence, I filed for an emergency custody hearing and requested a full psychological evaluation of all parties involved. Mark was furious, accusing me of being vindictive and trying to destroy his happiness. Sandra played the victim perfectly, claiming I was a bitter ex-wife who couldn't accept that my children loved their new mother figure. But the evidence was overwhelming. In court, Rebecca presented a timeline of Sandra's criminal history alongside documented changes in my children's behavior. The judge ordered an immediate investigation into Sandra's background and suspended her unsupervised access to my children, pending the outcome. The moment of truth came when Sandra was confronted with her real identity in open court. Her lawyer hadn't been informed of her criminal background, and when the prosecutor began reading her real criminal history, I watched her carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. Sandra's face went white as her convictions were read aloud. Her attorney was visibly shocked, repeatedly asking for clarification on dates and charges. Mark sat in stunned silence as he realized the woman he'd married was a complete stranger, with a history of destroying families. The psychological evaluation revealed that my children had been subjected to systematic parental alienation. They'd been fed a steady diet of lies about my character, my motivations, and my feelings toward them. Sandra had convinced them that their own mother was their enemy, while positioning herself as their protector and advocate. When Emma and Jake learned the truth about Sandra's identity and criminal history, their reactions were heartbreaking. Emma cried for hours, horrified that she'd been manipulated into believing such terrible things about me. Jake was angry at himself for falling for Sandra's lies, and angry at his father for not protecting him from her influence. The family court judge awarded me primary custody, with Mark receiving supervised visits until he could prove he'd ended his relationship with Sandra and undergone counseling to address his failure to protect his children. Sandra was ordered to have no contact with my children and faced additional criminal charges for her fraudulent marriage and identity theft. Mark's apology came 2 weeks later. He showed up at my door, broken and ashamed, begging me to forgive him for not believing me. He'd been so desperate for companionship after our divorce that he'd ignored red flags that seemed obvious in hindsight. Sandra had played him perfectly, isolating him from friends and family who might have questioned her story. The aftermath was both satisfying and sad. My children needed months of therapy to undo the psychological damage Sandra had inflicted. They struggled with guilt over how they'd treated me and anger at being manipulated. But slowly, our relationship began to heal. Sandra disappeared after the court hearing, probably to find her next victim in another state. Mark lost his job due to the stress and publicity of the case, and had to move in with his parents while he rebuilt his life. The house they'd shared was sold to pay legal fees and restitution. My children learned valuable lessons about manipulation and the importance of thinking critically about information they receive. They're more cautious now about trusting people too quickly, but they're also more appreciative of the genuine relationships in their lives. The most satisfying part of my revenge wasn't seeing Sandra's world collapse in court, though that was deeply gratifying. It was watching my children rediscover who they really were once they were free from her influence. They remembered that they loved me, that they enjoyed our time together, and that the bitter, jealous woman Sandra had described wasn't their mother at all. 6 months after the court case, Mark called me with an update that made my blood run cold. Sandra had been arrested in another state for the same crimes she'd committed against our family. She'd married another divorced father and was in the process of alienating his children from their mother when her new identity was discovered. The other mother had seen news coverage of our case and recognized Sandra's methods. She'd hired the same private investigator and uncovered Sandra's pattern of family destruction. This time, Sandra was facing federal charges for her multi-state fraud operation. My revenge had protected not just my own family, but potentially dozens of other families from Sandra's systematic destruction. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't just getting even. It's making sure the person who hurt you can never hurt anyone else the same way. Last month, Mark called with a request that would have seemed impossible a year ago. He's dating someone new, a woman with children of her own, and he wanted my advice on how to blend families successfully. He'd learned the hard way that not everyone who seems perfect actually is, and he wanted to make sure he never put his children at risk again. I told him the truth. The best way to protect your children is to never stop being their parent, even when someone else is trying to. Take your place. Sometimes the people who seem too good to be true are exactly that. And the price of believing their lies is higher than anyone should have to pay.